The news reports that flickered across theater screens and newspaper stands spoke in hushed, uncomfortable tones of a child star gone silent too soon, a bright Hollywood promise extinguished before it could become a woman's life. They told the public that Lucille Ricksen was dead. What they did not tell was how much of her life had already been taken long before her final breath. What followed those headlines was not simply a death, but a mystery soaked in ambition, exploitation, and an industry that devoured its youngest dreams whole. On April 13, 1925, Lucille Ricksen died at just 11 years old, and the official explanations would never fully quiet the unease that spread through Hollywood's golden corridors. Her passing would come to symbolize something far darker than illness or misfortune, a warning written into the history of cinema itself. Welcome to Starlet Mystery. Lucille Ricksen entered the world on January 23, 1914 in Chicago, Illinois, born into a modest family, at a time when motion pictures were still finding their voice. Her parents, ordinary people drawn by the promise of opportunity, could not have known that their daughter would become both a symbol of Hollywood's wonder and its most disturbing contradictions. From her earliest years, Lucille possessed a fragile beauty that cameras seemed to adore, pale-eyed and porcelain-faced, with an emotional intensity that felt almost unnatural for someone so young. When the family relocated to California, the move was driven by hope and necessity, the same forces that carried countless others westward. Hollywood was still a frontier then, less regulated, less restrained, and dangerously open to those who saw children not as lives to be protected, but as assets to be molded. Lucille's talent was noticed quickly. Even before she could fully understand what acting meant, she was placed in front of lights and lenses that would shape her identity long before she had a chance to form one of her own. Childhood for Lucille Ricksen was brief and transactional. Her days became structured around rehearsals, performances, and studio expectations, rather than play or schoolyard innocence. Those close to the family later recalled that Lucille was unusually serious, a child who carried herself with the composure of someone far older, as if she sensed that her value was tied to her performance. The laughter of childhood gave way to the discipline of production schedules, and the praise she received came with unspoken conditions. As Lucille entered adolescence, though she was still physically a child, the roles she was offered began to change in unsettling ways. Hollywood in the early 1920s had no real boundaries when it came to children on screen, and Lucille was increasingly cast in parts that demanded emotional and psychological maturity far beyond her years. She appeared opposite adult actors, placed in scenarios that blurred the line between innocence and adult themes, all under the guise of artistry. By 1922, Lucille had become a recognizable face in silent cinema, her performances praised for their depth and vulnerability. Audiences were moved by her ability to convey longing, fear, and devotion without words. Critics described her as a prodigy, a child who seemed born for tragedy. But behind the applause, there were whispers. According to those close to her, Lucille often appeared exhausted, withdrawn, and anxious. The studios demanded perfection, and perfection required obedience. Her breakthrough came swiftly, and with it, the machinery of fame closed in. By 1923, Lucille Ricksen was being positioned as one of Hollywood's most promising young stars, her image carefully curated and marketed. She worked under powerful producers who controlled every aspect of her career, and by extension, her life. Among them was Saul Lesser, a man whose name would later become inseparable from the darkest chapters of her story. At the peak of her brief fame, Lucille was rarely seen without an escort, rarely allowed moments of privacy. Her education was sporadic, her health increasingly fragile. Some believe that the emotional strain of her roles, combined with relentless work hours, began to erode her physical well-being. Others would later suggest that the damage ran far deeper, hidden behind studio walls and unspoken contracts. By 1924, rumors began to circulate within Hollywood circles, never printed, but quietly shared. According to those close to the production environment, Lucille was subjected to treatment that no child should endure. Her performances grew more intense, more haunting, as if she were drawing from pain too personal to be imagined. The line between performance and reality dissolved, and the industry applauded her for it. The turning point came not on a soundstage, but in the slow unraveling of her health. In early 1925, Lucille fell gravely ill. Official reports cited complications from illness, but the details were vague, shifting, and incomplete. She was hospitalized, her small body weakened, her future already slipping away. On April 13, 1925, Lucille Ricksen died, and Hollywood closed ranks. The studios released statements of sorrow. Newspapers framed her death as a tragic but natural loss, another fragile child claimed by illness. Yet the silence that followed was heavy, deliberate. It did not last. In the weeks after her death, allegations surfaced that would shake the industry's foundations. According to contemporaries and later investigative accounts, Lucille had been subjected to sexual abuse by powerful figures within the studio system. Saul Lesser's name emerged repeatedly, though legal accountability would never come. The details were painful, fragmented, and fiercely contested, but the pattern was unmistakable. A child star had been exploited, discarded, and then quietly buried beneath public relations statements. Hollywood's response was swift and defensive. The industry dismissed the accusations, discredited those who raised questions, and moved on. Lucille's films continued to play, her image frozen in time, eternally young, eternally obedient. Her voice, however, was gone. In the years that followed, Lucille Ricksen became a ghost in Hollywood history. Her story was referenced in hushed tones, cited in debates about child labor laws and studio power, but rarely explored in full. The discomfort surrounding her life ensured that her name faded from mainstream memory, replaced by safer legends and more marketable tragedies. Yet her legacy endured in quieter ways. Lucille's death contributed to growing awareness of the dangers faced by child performers, and her story would later be cited in discussions that led to reforms in child labor protections within the entertainment industry. She became an unspoken symbol of innocence, lost, of talent exploited, of an industry that learned its lessons too late. Lucille Ricksen did not live long enough to define herself beyond the roles written for her. She did not grow into adulthood, did not reclaim her narrative, did not escape the machinery that consumed her. What remains is a haunting question that lingers behind every frame of her films and every headline that once announced her promise. The news reports that announced her death marked the end of a life, but they also revealed the beginning of a reckoning. Behind those brief notices was a child whose story still whispers through Hollywood's shadows, reminding us that fame without protection is not a dream, but a danger, and that some stars burn brightest only because they are being consumed from within. The silence that followed Lucille Ricksen's burial did not bring peace. It created a vacuum, and into that emptiness flowed speculation, suppressed testimony, and a growing sense that something profoundly wrong had been concealed. Hollywood moved quickly, as it always did, to replace her image with the next child star, the next fragile face that could be shaped into profit. But Lucille's absence lingered in ways the industry could not fully erase. In the months after April 13, 1925, those closest to Lucille struggled with grief, layered with fear. According to later accounts, her mother became increasingly withdrawn, burdened by guilt and by pressures to remain silent. The studio system at the time wielded enormous influence, and families who depended on it understood the cost of speaking out. Contracts, threats of blacklisting, and quiet settlements formed an invisible barrier around the truth. Lucille's name was spoken less and less in public, but in private it carried weight. Behind closed doors, whispers hardened into accusations. Some believed Lucille's illness had been exacerbated by extreme physical and emotional stress, by schedules that ignored her frailty, and by expectations that treated her body as expendable. Others went further, insisting that the trauma she endured was not merely professional but deeply personal, inflicted by adults entrusted with her care. According to those close to early Hollywood insiders, those allegations were known, discussed, and deliberately buried. As the late 1920s unfolded, the film industry reinvented itself with sound, glamour, and a revised public image. The scandals of the silent era were quietly rewritten or forgotten. Lucille Ricksen's films became rarities, her name absent from retrospectives celebrating Hollywood's pioneers. Yet her story refused to disappear entirely. It surfaced in fragmented memoirs, in anonymous letters, in cautionary conversations about what it truly cost to be discovered too young. By the early 1930s, reform movements began to gain traction. Child labor laws were strengthened, studio schooling requirements were introduced, and the image of Hollywood as a benevolent dream factory was carefully reconstructed. Lucille was never mentioned directly in official statements, but those familiar with the era understood her influence. She had become an unacknowledged catalyst, a life whose suffering forced an industry to confront its most uncomfortable truths. Still, justice never arrived. No trials were held. No formal apologies were issued. The names associated with her exploitation continued to thrive, their careers largely untouched. This imbalance became part of Lucille's legacy, not only the tragedy of her death, but the reminder that power often outlives innocence. Decades later, historians and filmmakers began to revisit the darker corners of early Hollywood. Lucille Ricksen's name reemerged, no longer as a promising child actress, but as a symbol. Archival photographs showed a girl with solemn eyes, posed in costumes that suggested adulthood she had not reached. Viewers looking back could not unsee what audiences once accepted without question. Some believe Lucille's haunting screen presence came from an intuitive understanding that her life was not her own. According to those who studied her performances closely, there was a depth to her expressions that felt less like acting and more like endurance. Each role appeared to extract something irreversible from her, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion that the camera captured and immortalized. In the absence of definitive records, her final months remain partially obscured. Hospital reports from early 1925 were incomplete, and studio statements contradicted personal recollections. What is known is that Lucille spent her last days weakened, isolated, and removed from the world that had profited from her talent. The applause had stopped. The cameras were gone. What remained was a child confronting the end without the protection fame was supposed to provide. Lucille Ricksen's legacy is not measured in awards or box office success. It exists in the reforms she never lived to see, in the cautionary tales told to parents who send their children into the spotlight, and in the growing recognition that talent does not negate vulnerability. Her life challenges the romanticized mythology of Hollywood, exposing the cost of ambition when it is placed upon those too young to refuse. Today, her name surfaces in documentaries, academic studies, and conversations about accountability in entertainment. She is remembered not only for what she was, but for what she represented. A warning written into the foundation of an industry built on illusion. The news reports that once her death could never capture the full weight of her story. They marked the end of a life, but not the end of its meaning. Lucille Ricksen remains a shadow moving through cinema history, a reminder that behind every shining image is a human being, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only acknowledged, so they are never repeated. The silence that followed Lucille Ricksen's burial did not bring peace. It brought containment. Hollywood sealed her story, the way it sealed many inconvenient truths. Beneath contracts, influence, and a culture trained to forget its youngest casualties. Studios moved on quickly, new faces replacing old ones, while Lucille's name slipped from marquees and memory. Yet beneath that silence, something restless remained. In the months after April 13, 1925, the industry was forced to confront murmurs it could not fully suppress. Private conversations among journalists, reformers, and early child welfare advocates began to reference Lucille's fate as more than a medical tragedy. According to those who later spoke off record, her case circulated as an example of what happened when profit was allowed to eclipse protection. But the public never heard these discussions. What reached newspapers was sanitized grief, never accountability. Lucille's films continued to screen throughout 1925 and into 1926, her small figure flickering across cinema walls, preserved in an eternal present. Audiences watched her performances without context, unaware that the emotional weight she carried on screen had been drawn from a life under pressure. There was something unsettling in seeing her alive on screen after death, her expressions tender and trusting, while the truth of her circumstances remained buried. As the silent era progressed, Hollywood changed its face, but not its instincts. Child stars continued to be recruited, praised, and controlled. Yet Lucille Ricksen's story lingered beneath the surface, resurfacing whenever a young performer faltered or vanished from view. Some believe that her death contributed quietly to the tightening of regulations surrounding child labor in entertainment, reforms that would later be formalized but never retroactively save those already lost. By the early 1930s, Lucille had become a footnote, mentioned occasionally in retrospectives about silent film prodigies. Her name appeared beside others who burned out early, but the tone was cautious, almost apologetic. Historians avoided the darker implications, focusing instead on her talent and tragic brevity. It was safer that way. To examine her life honestly would have meant examining the industry itself. Decades passed before her story was revisited with any seriousness. In the mid-20th century, as Hollywood began to reckon with its past, writers and researchers started to re-examine early studio practices. Lucille Ricksen's name re-emerged in essays and books, exploring exploitation in early cinema. According to those close to these investigations, her case stood out not because it was unique, but because it was emblematic. What made Lucille's story particularly haunting was not just the allegations that surrounded her, but the absence of a voice to confirm or deny them. She left no memoirs, no interviews, no adulthood through which she might reinterpret her own experiences. Everything known about her was filtered through adults who benefited from her labor or failed to protect her. Her silence became part of the tragedy. As cultural conversations around abuse and power slowly evolved, Lucille Ricksen's life gained new relevance. By the late 1990s, her name appeared more frequently in discussions about the long history of exploitation in entertainment. Scholars and advocates referenced her story when arguing that abuse in Hollywood was not a modern revelation, but a pattern embedded from the industry's earliest days. According to those who studied archival records, Lucille's contracts were unusually restrictive, even by the standards of the time. Her work hours were extensive. Her schooling is minimal. Her guardianship is entangled with studio interests. These details, once overlooked, began to paint a clearer picture of how completely her life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. The question that lingered was not simply what happened to Lucille Ricksen, but how many others shared her fate without leaving a name behind. Her story became a lens through which the audience could glimpse a broader, more uncomfortable truth. The golden age of cinema, so often remembered for glamour and innovation, was also built on silence and sacrifice. Lucille's grave remained modest, unvisited by fans who no longer remembered her films. Yet her legacy lived on in policy, cautionary tales, and the quiet resolve of those who sought to protect future generations of performers. Her life influenced conversations that would eventually lead to stronger child actor protections, trust accounts, and oversight mechanisms, changes that came too late for her, but not for everyone. In retrospectives released in the early 21st century, Lucille Ricksen was finally acknowledged not just as a child star, but as a victim of systemic failure. Documentaries and articles reframed her story with the gravity it deserved, allowing her life to be understood not as a cautionary anecdote, but as a human tragedy. For the first time, the narrative shifted from curiosity to compassion. Yet even now, there are unanswered questions. Some believe that key records were destroyed. Others suspect that testimonies were deliberately suppressed. The full truth of Lucille Ricksen's experiences may never be known, lost to time and secrecy. What remains is an emotional imprint, a sense that something profoundly wrong occurred, and that it was allowed to happen. Lucille Ricksen did not live long enough to leave behind a body of work that could define her on her own terms. What she left instead was a warning etched into Hollywood history. Her life challenges the myth that fame is protection, that success equals safety, that applause can substitute for care. The news reports that announced her death reduced her life to a headline. But her story refuses to remain that small. It stretches across decades, whispering through every conversation about power, consent, and the cost of stardom. Lucille Ricksen remains frozen in time, a child forever performing for an audience that failed her. And as the echo of those old news reports fades once more into silence, one truth endures. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only remembered, so that the shadows they reveal are never allowed to grow unnoticed again.